Hopefully with Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about the strange reluctance across the entire Western world to arrest or prevent Antifa rioting, to arrest the perpetrators of the riots, and if at all that they are brought to a court, the extreme reluctance of the judges to find them guilty or accountable in any way, but also how Antifa lawyers can openly and Antifa activists can openly intimidate other sort of court officials, even the judge, and of course threaten the jurors as well. This would be something that would be shocking in any circumstances. Actually intimidating judges and courts in session and intimidating jurors. This would be deemed as incredible, and that the full force of the law and the Justice Department would be pursuing these people with vigor. But that isn't what's happening. In fact, the opposite is happening. So I'll come to a case that was recently in Oregon in the United States with a journalist, Andy Ngo, and his attempt to bring civil action against some Antifa members. But just looking at the cases, and I'm sort of doing, if you like, an amalgam of a number of cases, not just in the United States, but elsewhere. Now, there's footage of Antifa goons, masked and goggled and so on to limit or prevent identification. And they're openly destroying property, setting fires, beating people up quite badly in some situations, chasing after people who are running away and still beating them and so on. And yet there's no. The police stand by. You can see in the video footage, the police are just standing there doing nothing. Just now, here's a number of things here. The Antifa, it's not a demonstration. It's not like we've got a permit to go out and demonstrate or anything like that. So we've got people here who are committing numerous offences here, violations of the law, whether it be property damage, assault, threat to assault, and so on. All of these things the police could act on, but yet they don't. And this is not like they've got to find out or they've got to go through some sort of forensic evidence sifting or anything like that. These crimes are being committed right in front of them, and yet they do nothing. The police do nothing. The authorities do nothing. Now, just before any further on this, I just mentioning here, these are the same authorities that when a black person says that a rope to open a garage door, maybe a noose put there by a fucking white supremacist Nazi, then 20 FBI agents are assigned to the case. All resources are available and vast resources are put at the disposal of this maybe thing. But yet here, while the police are standing there, there's video footage and video evidence and so on. The police stand, nothing happens. Now, contrast the behaviour of the authorities here, again here. They do nothing about these Antifa. There's no federal investigation. There's no FBI agents assigned to the case. There's no exhaustive examination of phone records to see who was texting who and where at the time. None of that goes on. Yet there's a man handing out leaflets near an abortion clinic saying that life's sacred and how think again, consider keeping the child and this sort of thing. That person is arrested. That person has FBI and SWAT teams knocking on the door. There's no shortage of resources available to go chase after that person, but there seems to be no resources available to chase after Antifa. So we've got here two standards of application of the law. The tiniest misdemeanor gets a SWAT team if you're on the wrong side of the ideology, because that's what we're talking about here, ideological application, interpretation of the law. And yet the goons that are assaulting people, in some cases murdering people, setting fire to things, breaking property, committing numerous violations in front of the police, there are no resources to go and chase after them. And so this is very clearly setting the, if you like, setting up the architecture of the ideological law, because that's what we have at the moment. It's ideological law. It's not equal application of the law. So now let's come to some of the cases I've looked at, and I'm looking at this Andy Ngo, NGO, Andy Ngo, the journalist in the United States. So now he's assaulted, I think, twice on 2 occasions by Antifa thugs, and he tries the government doesn't take any interest in it. So the police aren't interested. The local attorney general or local prosecutor, they're not interested in going after Antifa. The federal Justice Department, FBI, none of these people are interested, even though blatant and brazen law breaking is taking place in an organised manner. No one's stopping them. Similarly, the Antifa people are all organising by texting each other and so on. And when that happens, not only can you determine the location of the person and their subsequent location, like where they live and that sort of stuff, but you've also got those text messages. So the Justice Department could easily go after these people if it wanted to, but it doesn't, and it leaves them alone. But it will, with great vigor, go after people on the other side of the ideological divide. Now, Antifa is spreading social unrest and mayhem and all sorts of things like that, which is, again, ideologically what the globalists want, and so they're in support of it because it's enabling and supporting the globalist project. Law and order and enforced law and order, one law applies to everything, legitimizes the system, or the very system that the globalists want to tear down. So they're not prepared to go after lawbreakers on the Antifa side. But if you complain about, if you use the wrong pronouns for somebody, or you complain about abortion clinics, then the full force of the law, aggressively and vigorously, the full force of the law will come after you, including SWAT teams at 6 o'clock or 5 o'clock in the morning. Fuck. So anyway, in this court case, various technicalities were put in Andy Ngo's way. So technicalities that don't matter a jot when the Justice Department wants to come after you. Technicalities, schmechnicalities, who cares? But in this instance, so Andy Ngo had to work through those. These are time-consuming, filing documents and sort of filing fees and going through those motions. That's time-consuming stuff and can get quite expensive if you're employing lawyers to do it. Finally, the government and the Justice Department, these people are no assistance to Andy Ngo at all in identifying the other parties around there. So they're just not bothering with that. They're making it as difficult for him as possible. But then you look at the actual court case itself. Now, let's take a January 6th court case where the government effectively can reverse the burden of proof. So the government's bringing the case and saying, well, this person is an insurrectionist, for example. Now, the government actually doesn't have to prove its case because the burden of proof is being reversed by these activist judges, and the majority of judges around the Western world are now activists. So the government can reverse the burden of proof, and the judge effectively allows, or that effectively does allow, the government to do that, and says, well, the accused has to prove that they're not an insurrectionist. Now, that's contrary to all sort of known standards of jurisprudence, but this is allowed in an activist court. So the person then has to meet a very high burden of proof. And they have to prove that they're not an insurrectionist, this very high burden of proof. And I'll come back to that in just a moment, what burden of proof means. Whereas the government meets a low burden of proof. Now, low burden of proof is you can allege it without evidence. So you can say, well, Billy Bob robbed the bank yesterday. Okay, well, that's it. As far as we're concerned, Billy Bob, you did it. You did it. That's it. You did it. You have to prove you didn't do it. Well, I can prove I wasn't in the city at the time. Well, that's not good enough, you see, says the activist judge. You have to prove you weren't even on planet Earth at the time. That's the burden of proof. So the judge can arbitrarily set the burden of proof that you have to meet before you can rebuff the zero burden of proof. That is an allegation that comes from the other side. So they say, well, Billy Bob robbed the bank. So the judge, Billy Bob, said, well, I can disprove that. I wasn't in the city at the time. Nah, don't accept that, said the judge. Well, I wasn't even in the state at the time. Nah, don't accept that. Well, I wasn't even in the country at the time. Nah, don't accept that. You have to prove you were not on planet Earth. And you have to have 99 astronauts who are with you in the spaceship to prove it. So the judge can arbitrarily set those standards of proof you have to meet. And this is in effect what happened to Andy Ngo, and as I understand it. And there's a very affirmative action judge was assigned to the case, but Andy Ngo has to prove his case, beyond the highest standards of doubt, whereas the people being accused can just go, I don't remember, I don't know, and that's good enough. That's good. So there's again two standards of evidence here. Now you could argue that the evidence here is Andy Ngo has to, or anyone has to prove their case beyond reasonable doubt, and they have the burden of proof. Given Andy Ngo is bringing the case, they have the burden of proof to prove that the other person did it. And I do accept that if it's universally applied, but it's not. It's applied ideologically. Andy Ngo's on the wrong side of the ideology. The Antifa goons are on the approved side of the ideology. Therefore, the burden of proof is much, much higher if you're on the wrong side of the ideology. It's much, much lower if you're on the approved side of the ideology. You can see this, and I noticed it constantly in say, the divorce court proceedings that that I reviewed. I lost a lot of employees that were very good through divorce court issues, and it wasn't worth their while continuing working, that sort of thing. So I took an interest in that and made a number of observations about how the divorce, and constantly it was the same thing. The man or the father, the husband, whatever you want to call him, is put under a very high burden of proof, whereas the woman, wife, mother is put on a very low burden of proof. So she only needs to say he's a violent abuser. That's it. Fact, fact, fact. So you have to prove you're not a violent abuser. Well, I've got 10 witnesses. Don't accept those. I wasn't even around. And that don't care. And so the burden of proof that the man has to meet is very high, and the burden of proof the woman needs to, this is in divorce court, is very low. But that same architecture of reversing the burden of proof one, but also putting one party under a very high burden of proof while giving a very low burden of proof free pass to the other. That architecture applied, in my view, at least in this Antifa thing. Now, it not only that, but Antifa goons were roaming around the courthouse, threatening people around, within the building and outside the building. Now, how do these people organize? Who organized these people? Where do they come from? How did they get there? How are they able to get this time off to spend days doing these threats and intimidations in and around the court? There was even in my opinion, at least, the activist lawyer, who's brazenly activist, by the way. There was no there was no holding back on her declaring her position on things. And she looked very Jewish, actually. I mean, didn't have a Jewish name, but she looked very Jewish. And she said that, in my view, at least, she threatened the jury members. I've remembered your faces, and if you decide the wrong way, then you'll be doxxed and so on. Plus, there are various threats around social media of doing this. Now, can you imagine if the jury in the January 6th court cases, if you imagine there were people who were threatening to dox and harass the jury members, or there were straight white males roaming around the courthouses threatening people, court officials and others in the courts to do January 6th. You imagine the full force, the absolute crushing force of the state would be applied to get all of these people and to say, see, we told you, Nazis. And every FBI agent in the universe would be assigned to this. And there would be no expense or resources would be spared in pursuing all these Nazis. But that same behavior is utterly acceptable, totally acceptable. Not one police officer intervened. To my knowledge, these people weren't even moved on. Nobody was arrested, or nobody was cautioned, or nobody was detained. No one's facing any charges for doing these brazen. The lawyer that did this in the court, threatened in my opinion, threatened the jurors. There's no one's arresting her. There's no FBI SWAT team on her door at 5 o'clock in the morning, and so on. So none of these activists that were brazenly, in my view, brazenly breaking the law, none of them were held account, arrested, or cautioned, or anything. Nothing. They weren't touched. They were allowed to run rampant without the slightest impediment or any obstacle being put in the way. Whereas almost every obstacle you can imagine, legal, technical, logistical, was put in Andy No's way. So clearly the state was doing everything they could to frustrate Andy No's case, and at the same time doing everything they could to assist Antifa and assist their activism. So the Justice Department and the Police Department, and Prosecution Department, they are effectively running, not effectively, they are, I mean, let's call it what it is, running protection for Antifa, because Antifa represents the side of the ideological divide and the side of the ideological narrative they support. But I just want to sort of highlight this because it indicates, or doesn't indicate, clearly outlines just how activist the legal infrastructure is. If the entire practice of jurisprudence was based on the law and facts, evidence, and equal application of the law and rules of evidence, burden of proof equally applied, and so on, then so many things the globalists do and have got away with and attempt, so many things would not be possible. It is absolutely essential that they infiltrate the justice, the entire workings of the justice system all across the Western world. They infiltrate all of it with activist jurists, activist judges, and activist officials, and clerks and administrators in the courts, and so on. That they infiltrate that whole thing and turn it over to the service of the globalist project rather than the application of and the practice of law. And that's what we're seeing now in that case with Antifa in Oregon with Andy No. That's just one more glaring example of how that's working out. You've been fantastic today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.